Good afternoon. Welcome to the Environmental Governance Lab's In Conversation event, COP26 in Glasgow, what happened, what it means, and what was missed. We're really glad to have you with us today. I'm Matt Hoffman, a professor in the Department of Political Science at U of T Scarborough, and one of the three co-directors of the Environmental Governance Lab here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Thank you for joining us. We've got a great event planned for this afternoon, and we're glad to see, so to speak, so many of you joining us today. First, what I'd like to begin with, as we so often and so appropriately do, is a land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement is important to me for this event, not only to acknowledge the specific peoples on whose traditional land I'm at least calling from today, especially the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River, but also because the COP, the discussions that happened in Glasgow, the results, what it means moving forward, all the things that we're going to dissect and discuss today from multiple angles, were yet another opportunity to continue to try and forge a more sustainable and low carbon world, a process and goal that connects deeply to the settler indigenous peoples relationship and our collective relationship and responsibility to this land and future generations. As was highlighted in Glasgow and is highlighted anytime we talk about climate change, indigenous peoples face some of the most significant threats from unsustainable practices, and many indigenous peoples are also at the forefront of efforts and activism to address them. Climate justice is a human rights issue and a key part of pursuing reconciliation. I'm grateful for our opportunity to work on this land today and to have this discussion from this land today as an opportunity to think deeply about what it takes to improve sustainability and justness of our world. All right, a few logistical notes before we get moving. I'm going to introduce our wonderful panel and give a bit of context for what happened in Glasgow. Just the highlights so that our panelists can talk with you about what they saw and thought about and what happened at what some are calling the most important COP since Paris. After my brief remarks, we're going to go to what you're here for, to hear from the panelists. Each of them is going to give a couple of minutes of some thoughts on their takeaways, their key takeaways about what happened, what was missed, what it all means. Then we're going to have some moderated discussion where I'm going to ask some follow-up questions from our panelists. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A with the audience, about 30 minutes from what we've got planned. All right, so to help us through thinking about what happened at Glasgow at the Conference of the Parties, the 26th time that the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have met, we've got an outstanding set of speakers. I'm really excited about having this discussion. First, we have Jennifer Allen. Dr. Jennifer Allen is a lecturer at Cardiff University and strategic advisor and team leader with the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. This is a publication that reports on all of the major environmental conferences. So I'm sure she's exhausted, or at least maybe sort of still full of adrenaline from reporting on this for 2 weeks. Dr. Allen's research explores environmental and social movements and how global rules are made and remade. Her publications engage with a wide range of environmental issues, including climate change, biodiversity, forest protection, and chemical and waste management. Through contributing to the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, she has attended roughly 40 UN conferences where states negotiate the rules of global environmental governance, and she has published over 100 bulletins with her ENB colleagues. She also edits a yearly roundup of the state of global environmental governance for ENB. Second, we have Amelie Wilkinson. Amelie is a dedicated climate justice advocate and second-year undergraduate student at the University of Toronto, where she double majors in international relations and peace, conflict, and justice studies. She leads the Toronto chapter of Stop Ecocide Canada, an organization dedicated to the criminalization of ecocide at the International Criminal Court as a deterrent and accountability mechanism for environmental destruction. Amelie has long been a strong social justice advocate, leading U of T's Hart House High School's Women and Gender Minorities Debate Tournament in 2021, speaking on issues of climate and gender justice as her high school's valedictorian, and more. We then have Raul Salas Reyes. Raul is a senior PhD candidate in the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at UTSC and a recent returnee from Glasgow, where he was doing some of his PhD research. He is currently researching the evolution of the differential treatment norm in climate regime, which is embedded within the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Raul has been working in climate governance and transparency issues for more than a decade, where he has assisted developing and developed countries in meeting their obligations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And last but not least, we'll have Kimberly Marian Suisia. Kim is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and Environmental Policy and Culture program at Northwestern University. Trained as an interdisciplinary environmental social scientist, Kim's research examines complex questions around how the politics of justice and representation and different approaches to addressing global environmental challenges are negotiated and experienced from global to local scales, with particular attention to Indigenous peoples and environmental justice communities. She co-leads the Presence to Influence project that examines how Indigenous peoples influence international climate change and biodiversity policies, and the disproportionate impacts of environmental change working group that is co-developing transdisciplinary resilience research initiatives with tribal nations and Indigenous communities in the US and Southeast Asia. All right, so with this wonderful panel, we're going to explore what just happened at COP26 in Glasgow, right? This was kind of a weird situation where there was so much going on. So many announcements came out over the last 2 weeks, so much news, and yet so much angst about how little was being accomplished. We're going to try and sort through that today, right? And I'm going to give you a little bit of context for what happened for those of you that weren't following the news every morning or every afternoon as closely as maybe some of us on the panel were, right? And so for those, and just as the briefest introduction, the Conference of the Parties is the annual climate change negotiation meetings where countries come together to try and work out the collective global response to climate change. This has been happening annually for, well, these 27 years under these COPs, where essentially, in this case with Glasgow, the countries came together to try and finish up all the details of Paris, work on new ambition moving forward, and see if it would be possible to get or keep within reach the 1.5 degree target that is the sort of centerpiece of the Paris Agreement on climate change. The first week, so 2 weeks ago, was a high-level session where many world leaders came together with lots of pledges from states around net zero by 2050 commitments and some updated nationally determined contributions. Because remember, under the Paris Agreement, the core of the global response to climate change is now based on what nations are individually pledging to do with their climate plans domestically. There's some positives in this first week, but there wasn't enough coming from these pledges, from the nationally determined commitments, to get the world onto a 1.5 degree track. Pledges, what the estimates I've seen, the pledges that people have made since Glasgow or in Glasgow and leading up to Glasgow, put the world on a trajectory for 2.4 degrees of warming if everything in the pledges is implemented, right? There were also lots of big announcements in this first week beyond the states. I'll just highlight one from the financial sector. Mark Carney, Canadian, heading up a group of institutional investors worth a combined $130 trillion, that's trillion with a T, committed to aligning their investment behavior with net zero goals by 2050. And so the first week had a number of these large announcements from heads of state, from a number of actors around the negotiations interested in climate change. This is where a lot of very ambitious things were said, right? The second week saw the negotiations ramp up on the cooperative aspects of global climate governance, right? Again, so there's the core of climate change regime right now is individual nationally determined commitments, but there's still a number of collective or cooperative aspects of climate governance that the Conference of the Parties needs to work out. And we had quite a few outcomes from these negotiations, enough that it's going to take governments, observers, and scholars quite a while to figure out what all was decided and what it all means. And sort of our first step today is to ask these experts to help us through thinking this. We got an agreement at the end, on only a day late. This sort of ran long, but not as long as some of these things run. The world made some progress on a number of issues, didn't make enough progress for most observers to be happy with the outcome. And at the end of the day, national action and implementation of climate plans has to come fast and broad. So that hasn't really changed. Two sets of formal outcomes, though, seem important from what came out of the last 2 weeks, or the last week especially. First, the international community achieved what's now being called the Glasgow Pact. This covers a whole range of issues, and it's in some ways more a statement of principles than an expression of concrete action or legally binding commitments, although we can talk about the language that's in it. And it essentially lays out how countries are willing to publicly characterize the needs of the global response to climate change. And there's some notable things that came out of the Glasgow Pact. You somewhat with a 1 step forward, 2 steps back, kind of a week, but we do have now language around a phase down of coal and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. The language started out as phase out, but was watered down over the course of the negotiations. But this is the first time that a fossil fuel was specifically targeted in a climate agreement. And so that's at least some notion of progress. We almost got a loss and damage institution, something, this is the furthest that loss and damage discussions have gotten, where northern states would be accountable for damage in southern states. But we ended up with a continuing commitment to talk about loss and damage and coming up with some institutional rules around this. The lack or the missed goals around financial transfer pledges were definitely critiqued, and financial pledges from the global north to the global south were repledged. And I think something notable here is that climate adaptation got a much higher profile than it has in previous COPs. So that's the Glasgow Pact. Second, and this is a little bit more sort of in the weeds of multilateralism, but I think important, is the Paris Rulebook was mostly completed, right? And so the Paris Agreement set out what the international community is going to do around climate change, but it left a number of important rules for how countries were going to work on the cooperative aspects of the climate regime. It left those for future negotiations. And at Glasgow, we actually got some of those rules finalized. We got rules around trading carbon credits internationally that addressed at least some concerns about double counting. We got rules around transparency and reporting of emissions and progress. Rules around the common use of common timeframes for designing NDCs, and rules for the global stocktake to see where countries are at in terms of how we're doing vis-a-vis the Paris goals. All right, enough from me. This is just, I just wanted to give a brief overview in terms of some of the highlights of what happened over the last 2 weeks. This just scratches the surface and doesn't even get into what non-parties were doing and thinking at the negotiations. And they were pushing for a lot more climate action, a lot more action on climate justice, and rightly protesting what they saw as the lack of progress and ambition and more. And so I think we're going to get into the whole range of what was happening the last 2 weeks and what wasn't happening in the last 2 weeks that probably needed to. So to get us through this, again, we've got our wonderful panel. And what we're going to do is that each one of them is going to take a few minutes to give us their takeaways. And then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion amongst the panelists before we open it up to Q&A. If you have questions as people are speaking, go ahead and use your Q&A function. I'll be monitoring that and I won't lose those. So if you want to ask, you don't have to wait till the end to put questions in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jen Allen. Jen.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks for that roundup. It's very helpful. So I think I have either 4.5 or 5 takeaways. So we'll see how this goes. I think the first one that maybe has been a bit overlooked is that 1.5 degrees is here to stay as the goal of the Paris Agreement. So technically the Paris Agreement says that the goal is to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees and pursue all efforts towards 1.5. 2 degrees was hardly mentioned. And I don't think this is sort of something to just pass by, because when they were negotiating the Paris Agreement, it was a hard push to get that reference to 1.5. The Saudi Arabian delegation, for example, had explicit orders not to see it, and that was a big give that they did to even have that number in the agreement. So I don't think that we can really say that, now that we're only talking about the drive for 1.5, the race to 1.5, however transport related metaphor you want to use, verb towards 1.5, we're only talking about this. And this is the result of years of work from the UN Secretary General's office, from campaigners, from activists, to focus on 1.5. So the fact that the Saudis and other countries didn't blink at seeing 1.5 in there, and an ambitious conversation drawing from the IPCC's 1.5 report about how to decarbonize and the rate for decarbonization and reducing emissions, that's in there. And I think that recognition is something that isn't really getting much attention, but matters normatively. So I think that's my first one. My second is around continuity, as you mentioned, Matt, and in two ways. One is we didn't see really ambitious pledges. And one of the big pushes for having world leaders there, well, there were two. One was, remember, this is a newly post-Brexit UK, and there was that domestic push to have sort of a big party as our new, country outside the EU. But also there was a sense that pushing world leaders to show up would also push them to show up and announce something. And that didn't work with most. Most of them stood up there and just reiterated what was in their NDC. There were financial pledges, 800 million to the adaptation fund. That's really not that much money. So that part didn't really work. The forest declaration, how many forest declarations have we already had that promised to halt or half deforestation by 2020, 2030? I mean, I think we came up with 3 or 4 just off the top of our heads on that day. The Global Methane Pledge, that was announced in September. It just got bigger here. So a lot of continuity in some of these announcements that were being trumped as sort of new and exciting. I also want to mention the continuity in the US position, because this really matters. So it sounded like the US was back, that they were again going to lead the world into this green or clean, or I guess I keep trying to say those two words together, revolution. In the negotiating room, you wouldn't know that it was a different US administration. So it was the same US position on finance, the same US position on loss and damage in 2 ways. One, in terms of, is loss and damage under the convention only, or is it also a Paris Agreement issue? And second, on finance. So many developed countries arrived in Glasgow without even a mandate to talk about finance for loss and damage. So the closest we got was a technical facility to provide technical support and assistance. Nothing on finance. There was no mandate by most countries or most negotiators to even talk about it. So again, US might be, we're all very happy to see them, but maybe we shouldn't have been quite so happy to see them. But Obama gave an okay speech. The third one, you mentioned this pact, and this Glasgow Climate Pact is interesting from a procedural point of view. So apologies, I'm about to get very nerdy. It's technically called an overarching cover decision, and there were technically 3 of them. What this means is usually there's a mandate for such things. So we've had the Bali Action Plan, for example, or the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement. And so it's when the presidency has a mandate to negotiate this sort of overarching decision that'll put together all these pieces. There wasn't a mandate for that in Glasgow. The reason why these cover decisions existed was because there's no place to talk about mitigation on the formal negotiating agendas of the climate regime, which is probably by design by someone, but nevertheless, it's not there. So if you want to have a call for more ambitious NDCs, if you want to talk about mitigation in any way, the presidency had to figure out something to do here. So in Madrid, they tried these cover decisions. They were called the Chile-Madrid Time for Action or something. In Glasgow, they said, okay, we're going to try the same thing, hopefully with a different result. So this is interesting because now these overarching cover decisions are a thing. They're not going to go away. Darn right, the African group is going to do one in Egypt. UAE will do one in the Asia Pacific COP after that. And at first, delegates didn't like this because there was no mandate. It was purely a presidency initiative that they hadn't given the mandate for. Second, it ate up a lot of resources. Heads of delegation spent dozens of hours on this. So the top level of delegate on each delegation was tied up in this for dozens of hours at least, and multiple iterations of this text. It also opened up strategic negotiating opportunities. So if you didn't like what was happening in a specific area of negotiations, maybe you try to float some language into the cover decision that could make it okay if that fails over here. So it really made the negotiations much more complex. And that's a bit of loss and damage. So the cover decision includes this 2-year dialogue thing. The actual substantive decision under its proper agenda item is strengthening the Santiago network. So both are weak outcomes, but there's no reason why that dialogue couldn't have sat under its proper agenda item. It was the strategic interplay that was happening. So these are sort of going to be symbolic, like the fossil fuel subsidy reference. Maybe it'll talk about the political direction and it'll be crafting political narratives going forward and sort of ways to kind of make up potentially for shortfalls in the agenda as the presidency and parties see it. But yeah, this is something we're going to continue to have. So whoever makes up the name of these better start coming up with better names than Glasgow Climate Pact. Actually, it was going to be named something else at some point, a catalyst for climate action or something. So the comms people at least will be happy. I guess the fourth one, you mentioned finishing the rule book. So the thing for me with this is that it means two things. One is that the Paris Agreement's here to stay. So there was a little bit of an attempt to rewrite some Paris Agreement language here. There was going to be a call to update pledges every year. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle. So that was an attempt by the least developed countries to push countries to put more ambitious pledges in every single year. I think that was more their starting negotiation tactic, because they also recognize these documents take about 6 months to prepare. So you'd be spending half your time writing it and half your time implementing it, kind of thing. But that didn't work out. So it means that there's still a lot of support for having Paris Agreement mechanisms in place. We're not rewriting it, it's here to stay. With the completion of the rule book, it means that for the first time in a really long time, like since 2005, we are fully in implementation mode in the climate regime. We're not negotiating anything new, which is interesting. 16 years, that's entire diplomats' careers, right? So fully in implementation mode. It means we're not going to be devoting resources to new rules. It means countries are going to be under the spotlight to live up to their obligations across the board, whether it's mitigating or adaptation or finance. It also might mean that we see a contraction of the regime. And this will be interesting to see if it happens. Most issue areas, most treaties, once they hit implementation phase, Civil society is less interested. Other international organizations are a bit less interested. They tend to get smaller because it's boring in the negotiations now. It matters a lot, but it's a little bit less sexy than negotiating a new treaty. So climate might buck that trend because so much else happens in the climate space. It's the place to be for sustainable development. But that'll be interesting to see going forward, I think. So I'll leave it there, and I'm very keen to hear what others have to say.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jen. That's great. That really gives us a lot to chew on there. Amelie, over to you.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciated that. That was quite insightful into the nitty gritty. What I wanted to do is take a little bit of a step back in my remarks. So over the past 2 weeks, I've tried to figure out what out of everything that happened at COP was kind of most important from a youth perspective. And I've been speaking with dozens of my colleagues who have varied positions in relation to the conference. So youth activists, a senior communications official with the Canadian government, a young news reporter with the Toronto Star, and just many Canadian university students who are engaged with the topic. And one really key sentiment that was brought up quite clearly to me by Jamie Hunter, who's one of the co-founders of Stop Ecocide Canada, was that we talk a lot about youth voice in these climate conferences and in general climate politics, but oftentimes it's just a political line. We generally are given short meetings with officials, and we become a token, a selfie or an offhanded sentence in some declaration. This is a pretty big problem because climate action today, as we all know, will determine the future of our entire generation. And we really do have some substantive ideas that we are bringing to the table. So today, what I wanted to do was highlight the path and the role played by some of these ideas in the lead up and then in COP26. So starting off, the road to COP was pretty important in terms of youth climate action. And I want to take a moment to talk about 3 specific conferences that happened. So the first was Mock COP26. When COP26, originally scheduled for 2020, was postponed to 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, youth from around the world kind of stood up and we said, climate action can't wait. A year of inaction is a pretty big issue in climate politics, just because so much of this depends on the momentum that's being built up by the movement, the continuous pressure on leaders. And so the consensus was that if leaders wouldn't run COP26 in 2020, then youth would, and they did. From November 19th to December 1st, 2020, Mock COP ran completely online with 330 delegates from 142 nations. And it was more inclusive than traditional COPs. So just highlighting that 72% of delegates were from the Global South and 63% were not cisgender males. This is pretty big, just considering the kind of inequitable history of climate conferences. And then something else to note is that it was completely online. So the CO2 emissions from Mock COP were a fraction of what they would have been for an in-person conference. And the event culminated in this powerful conference statement, which began to crystallize the policy demands of youth leaders. It also was key in keeping the momentum going for climate politics. Then we had the Youth for COP Climate Summit, Driving Ambition, in September of this year. And this was the first official pre-COP summit that was exclusively for young people. So some 400 youth developed a declaration that was presented to global leaders. And reading this manifesto, for me at least, is quite astounding because the statement is by far more detailed and more concrete, in my opinion, than the Glasgow Climate Pact or any of the agreements coming out of COP26. It took 3 days, and youth from every corner of the globe agreed on a detailed set of policy demands around topics from industry adaptation to ending fossil fuel subsidies, engaging sports, media, art, and fashion industries, financing youth initiatives, and so much more. And then right before COP, we had a third conference. This one was Conference of Youth, COI 16, and not its own conference. COIs are rather a space for youth capacity building to make sure that they're trained and ready for their participation in COP. It also put out a policy proposition document. And then we arrive at the 26th Conference of the Parties. And one thing that I've been asking a lot of youth, and I've been really considering, is were all these policies, was all this momentum from youth and this policy training really heard in Blue Zone negotiations? The answer that I've been getting is not entirely, but we did get some action. So from my conversations, the reiteration and the upping of commitments around methane, phasing out coal, ending international finance for unabated fossil fuel projects, these were exciting to hear, and they're obviously exciting headlines. But for many people, it's quite hard to be fully in support of these agreements when there are some pretty critical flaws coming out of them. For example, they're quite general. Due to their transactional nature, they're often hesitant to use controversial wordings. So anything from the term climate justice, which in my opinion should not be controversial at all, to things like phasing out coal, which was turned into phasing down coal in the final agreement. And they also just lack clear measurements or enforcement mechanisms. So overall, in the blue zone, what I've been hearing from a lot of youth is that we really didn't get the adoption of policies that were created at the youth conferences I talked about. But in my opinion, an equally important COP occurs outside of these formal negotiations and the nitty-gritty of negotiators at the table. In events, in webinars, and in gatherings around the city, COP26 was a fantastic networking opportunity for a lot of NGOs and smaller environmental campaigns. So there were daily protests in the streets of Glasgow where civil society, youth, and underrepresented groups came together to demand higher ambition. Particularly on Friday, November 5th, it was Youth Day at COP. So instead of focusing on how we could get negotiations to focus on this, thousands of youth, hundreds of thousands, took to the streets, not only in Glasgow, but in decentralized protests around the world. And this was quite powerful. Even just looking at the images, this was huge. They were wildly publicized, and they sent the messages that we're here, we care, and we're not going to stop putting pressure on politicians and fighting for change. This was really key, in my opinion, for just putting pressure on policymakers and reminding them why they're negotiating, why they're at the table, why they need to be more ambitious. But all this considered, I think I've come to the question, was COP26 successful? And it's an answer that depends on your metric, and it's a tough one to answer definitively. But from the discussions I've been having, the overriding answer is not yet, but it can be. Why? Well, I think the ambitious long-term intentions that have come out are generally positive. The International Energy Agency reported that if we consider all new targets set out at COP26, the world could potentially keep warming to 1.8 degrees. Now, this is big because it's not 1.5, but it's under the 2-degree threshold. However, what isn't mentioned in this is that it's the most optimistic scenario. It assumes that countries actually and promptly do everything they're saying. And this captures a pretty broad concern. Will the ambition, will the momentum built at COP26 lead to real action? Will the declarations elicit any change in behavior? And there are a lot of conflicting opinions on this. I think Jennifer spoke to this, and we can obviously delve into it later. What's clear to me and what's becoming clear to a lot of young activists is that it has to be time right now for action. We can't keep saying action will be deferred to the next climate conference to next year. It's time for, as Jennifer mentioned, implementation as opposed to continuing negotiations. And so we need to be looking at things like supporting climate conscious politicians, monitoring who sticks to the pacts that were made at COP26, naming and shaming those who don't, and then pursuing other legal, social, political, and economic efforts at accountability. Then I think in that situation, it's possible for the momentum and the foundations built at COP26 to be a success. So that's kind of what I had to say. I'll turn it back to Matthew.
Thank you so much, Amelie. That was excellent. And I think a really important perspective moving forward. Raul.
Thanks so much, Matthew. And thank you so much, Dr. Allen and Amelie. Really what my interventions will build upon what has already been said. So I will focus on 3 reflections on what it means and 3 reflections on what was missed. So on what it means, I will reflect on the role of science in COP26, the internalization of net zero, and the enhanced transparency framework. So science was really at the forefront of COP26. That the Glasgow Climate Pact has science and urgency as the first item is really no random event. I think the order of headings in these documents are cautiously and meticulously planned. So recognition to the importance of the best available science for effective climate action and policymaking, and welcoming the contribution of Working Group 1 to the IPCC on the 6th assessment report is really something to highlight. In previous COPs, science has been significantly debated and contested, and one clear example was COP24 in Katowice. Well, strong debates took place just to recognize the IPCC's 1.5 report. So I came back from COP26 with the reflection. The science was at the forefront of these negotiations. And at least in the negotiating rooms that I had access to, which is a completely different issue, everyone agreed, and even parties made references to the IPCC's reports, and there was no contestation and rebuttal from other parties. That is a very different scenario of previous COPs that I attended to. The second reflection that I thought was extremely important is the internalization of net zero. And the term net zero, well, it's just rather complex. It's a term that went through significant contestation during the negotiations of the Paris Agreement. I mean, if you look at the text in the Paris Agreement in Article 4.1, net zero is not mentioned. This was not acceptable to many parties. And so through a process of constructed ambiguity, the president of COP21 proposed a language that we all know, and that is so as to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century. So the adoption of the Glasgow Climate Pact, it deviates from this language, and it clearly states the need to reduce global carbon dioxide emissions by net zero around mid-century, as well as deep reduction in other greenhouse gases. So this is important to highlight. The emphasis here is the focus on net zero carbon, but not other greenhouse gas emissions. Now, my third reflection, it builds upon also on Dr. Allen's comments and Emily's comments about the enhanced transparency framework. So the completion of the Paris rulebook really operationalizes the ETF. And this is going to play a key role, one, as Matthew mentioned, on the Biennial Transparency, on the global stocktake. So the Biennial Transparency report that will be submitted by 2024 will provide inputs to this process. But also the ETF contains really interesting elements. One is because parties will have to report how do they account for their NDCs. So this really enables an important discussion. And an ETF in operation will give a better and clearer picture of the implementation of NDCs, which we haven't seen. Some have mentioned it's really at the moment just pledges, but the real implementation is going to be reported now on. Now, what was missed? And on the last day of COP26, I think that the attention was focused on the last minute intervention and phasing down coal rather than phasing out. But there were other outcomes from this COP that are significant and were missed. And so really my reflections, I'll try to focus on some of these, and really they also build upon the reflections from Dr. Allen and Emily. So I will focus on three things. One is the multilaterally agreed definition of climate finance, sentiment of broken trust, and the missing language on the loss and damage facility. That are something I think is going to be interesting to follow up in the next coming years. Now, the first reflection on what was missed is the expression of a need for a multilaterally agreed definition of climate finance. As we all know, there is no single definition agreed on what is climate finance. And developing countries throughout the negotiations in COP26 strongly voiced their support for the need of a globally adopted multilaterally definition of climate finance. And on the other hand, developed countries say that this has to be nationally determined. So they say that the Paris Agreement and the nature of the Paris Agreement has to be nationally determined. And this was fiercely debated in the negotiating rooms. And that's definitely something to follow up. Now, the commitment is on the Standing Committee on Finance. They will work on definitions for climate finance. But whether we will get to this point is still something that we need to look at. But there are contesting views on this, very strong ones. The second reflection that was missed is a strong sentiment of broken trust. The developing countries, least developed countries, and small island developing states clearly expressed. I attended many negotiations in COP26, and it was not uncommon to hear expressions like, "You have broken our trust," or "How can we believe you? You have not met the agreed commitment on 100 billion a year." I think this is important. The sentiment is something that I haven't heard in previous COPs. It resounded in all the negotiating rooms that I went to, and I think this also links to my previous reflection. And my third reflection on what was missed is a missing word of the loss and damage facility. Now, this is important because loss and damage, as we all saw, is a fundamental piece of the climate regime. And a great deal of countries want to elevate loss and damage to the level of mitigation and adaptation. And it is also important because there are competing views on how to provide support, if you want to call support, for loss and damage. So one example was, for example, in the negotiating rooms, some countries suggested that loss and damage should be managed by the support they get should be managed by charity institutions. This really shifts away from current debates on loss and damage, and there is a strong contestation also taking place here. So these three reflections on what was missed will certainly play a role in the next coming years, and I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Roel. That was excellent. Kim, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate. And I really appreciated your land acknowledgement, Matt, at the beginning, because I think it's critical that we think about where we are and the relationships that really drive our work forward. And this is something that that really sort of shapes how I think about COP26 and what came out of it or did not come out of it. And so some of the reflections I'm sharing really come out of the team of researchers that I work with that include Laura Zanotti at Purdue University, and then Diana Elhard, Lauren Baker, Maggie O'Connell, and Alex Anderson at Northwestern. I just want to make sure I acknowledge that my statements are very much informed by their contributions. So I come from a different perspective than the other panelists, and I'll try to build on what they said, but I'm going to actually start with the opening days of COP21 in Paris. So 6 years ago, as I walked into the hallways of COP21, Indigenous leaders were repeatedly saying there should be no COP22 if Indigenous rights were not recognized and respected in the Paris Agreement. So this was in the hallways, in presentations, and in Q&A sessions. The importance of Indigenous rights for effectively addressing climate change could not be more clear. During that COP, Indigenous leaders fought hard to keep references to Indigenous rights and human rights in the agreement. And ultimately, while these were not included in any of the articles of the Paris Agreement, they did secure references to Indigenous rights and human rights in the preamble to the Paris Agreement. And as COP26 was unfolding, I couldn't help but reflect on those struggles and ask why, again, are we fighting over basic human rights and Indigenous rights? Why are these continuing to be ignored and undermined in our global climate negotiations? And I really, I feel like I'm going to bring us all down here, but it's a question of why does it remain acceptable to world leaders, fellow global citizens, and scientists that frontline environmental justice communities, including Indigenous communities, should continue to bear the extraordinarily unjust costs of climate change and climate solutions. And so when I think about the key takeaways and what was missed for COP26, I think about justice emerging from COP26 and justice as it unfolded in COP26. So if we look at the cover, what is it called? The cover letter, cover agreement that came out, there's a quote that says, climate justice is important to some, right? And I think as Amelie was mentioning, it's not negotiable. Climate justice is exactly what these COPs are about. And decisions made at COP26 continue to sacrifice the most vulnerable, oppressed, and marginalized communities, which generates cascading injustices for Earth, for plants, animals, for humans, both present and future. And it really also limits our ability to effectively address climate change. My second frustration, I guess these are my frustrations, not my takeaways. But so we've dedicated so many resources and time to technical solutions, to economic solutions, and we really need to be focusing on social solutions. We can't wait anymore. These are social problems, and if we continue to ignore the material contributions of Indigenous peoples, if at a minimum we're thinking about solving climate change, just paying attention to material contributions of Indigenous peoples to mitigating climate change, if we ignore those, we're removing one of the most important solutions to climate change. And so then I also want to talk about how this sort of persistent injustice that's emerging from climate negotiations is actually produced in the COP, right? So this year, the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion was in the blue zone, and this was a departure from the prior 5 COPs where the pavilion was in the green zone. So I'm not yet sure what effect this had. I mean, on the one hand, could closer proximity to parties help advance Indigenous concerns, or could the limited access impact the solidarity of Indigenous communities that usually is generated through their engagements at the IPP? Second, and my team that was at COP26 spoke a lot about this, that, you know, for me to go to COP or for my students to go to COP, the risks of coming home from COP are not as high as it is for Indigenous delegates who are returning home and are not, it's not only a personal risk, but it's a concern of bringing back COVID to their communities and really sort of thinking about this ethical dilemmas that Indigenous delegates are confronting in order to be able to claim their seat at the table. And so I think that in terms of my takeaways, what really was missed here was an opportunity to move closer towards a just centered solution to climate change, one that affirmed Indigenous rights, land rights, tenure security, and one that also fully sort of embraced the role that Indigenous knowledge plays alongside science in helping us move forward. So to me, it's really frustrating again, and I'll be interested to see if there's a COP27 based on the sentiments from COP21. But on that downer note, I'll turn it back over to you.
I'm not sure that you can claim the mantle of always bringing people down when we're talking about climate change. We already started down, so it's okay. We're going to see if we can rescue some momentum from that. So I have a question for each of you, and actually I'm going to go in reverse order. Kim, I think your characterization of the COP and global response to climate change in terms of persistent injustice really resonates, right? This is something that I think has been recognized by a number of groups, but yet hasn't changed anything. And so, and your call at the end is we missed an opportunity to move closer to a justice-centered sort of response to climate change. Should there be a COP27? Let's put you on the spot. I mean, or is this, is the COP a place where climate justice can actually be pursued, or are COPs essentially inherently going to be obstacles to pursuing climate justice?
Well, to put me on the spot there. No, that's a tough question. You know, for as much as is not achieved at these COPs, they do play a really important role as a convening space for peoples and groups that do not have sufficient or adequate political representation in nation state spaces, right? And so where while most nations have now signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this is not being implemented broadly. And so I think in terms of being able, as a venue for like the youth delegation, the Indigenous delegation, that these are spaces that really are critical for building solidarity and keeping those rights movements moving forward. So in the sense, like, if we're asking if there should be a COP26 or COP27 in order to solve the climate problem, I don't know. But if we're asking about whether or not it's a space to maybe rethink the practice of global democracy and really kind of pushing us to stop always reifying the nation state as the only central actor in the world that can address these problems, I think it does play a role there.
So it's interesting, though, that you're suggesting that a multilateral process is going to decenter the nation state. Is this going to happen?
Well, I don't know if it'll fully decenter it, but what I do see happening is there has been significant shifts in Indigenous representation in global environmental governance broadly, and it's happening because in part of their attendance and their ability to influence negotiations like climate COPs. And so, I think Indigenous nations, as we have in the United States, tribal nations have a nation-to-nation status. So they have a legitimate seat to claim in these multilateral processes in a certain sense. And so I think that we should, the idea is we want better, higher quality diplomacy and engagement, and not such exclusive, narrow-minded and almost sort of routinized engagement, which I think is what nation states tend to do. But Indigenous peoples and the youth especially, I loved like their eyes are watching protests that happened at COP26, right? Like if people can't get that voice at home, they're going to find it somewhere. And so to me, that's the inspiring part of these kinds of meetings.
Thank you. Thank you. Raul, I'm interested that one of your reflections on what was missed at the COP was about broken trust. And I've always thought that one of the key pillars that we don't think enough about in terms of why we got even the Paris Agreement was the bargain around North-South finance, right? I don't think we get Paris without that $100 billion pledge, or at least Paris, and not in the way that that it came to be. And yeah, I think it's really important how you noted the sort of visceral reaction to missing that target that showed up in the negotiations. What do you think the implications of that are moving forward? Given that, I mean, and you even saw sort of that last plenary, a number of states from the global South got up and said, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, this totally sucked, but we're going to move forward in a spirit of compromise. But what are the implications of that that broken trust, do you think, moving forward?
Okay, so thank you so much for the question, and definitely to me it was interesting. It's sometimes is when you go to negotiations, it tends to be very theatrical, but these times, and specifically the ones on finance, they were very passionate, very human. You saw people getting upset. Developing states really they voiced this concern, and this was a human sentiment. So I think that's one part that is important to recognize. That means that one, I think there's going to be a strong pushback, very likely in future negotiations and important items for the developing countries and small developments for seats and LDCs. The way that I see this, and I think COP27 is going to be fundamental because it's going to be in Egypt. And as Dr. Allen mentioned, the presidency plays a significant role. It's not, it's almost like the puppeteer. It sets the scene of what's going to happen. So having the next COP in Africa, representing many African states that voiced this broken trust, there's going to be a pushback on climate finance. Now, the 100 billion year goal is an important number, but there are open questions. NDCs, we have no idea how much they cost to implement. That's worrying. Countries were actually talking about quadrupling, even in the negotiations. We ended up with a double language, but there was a contestation about having 4 times the type of finance that was given to adaptation, only to adaptation, and move up at the 20% that was, I think it was about 24-27% on climate finance and adaptation to almost 50-50. The broken trust sentiment, I think, is going to be playing a very important role because countries have really debated when a developed country says, for example, the EU mentioned several times that we really want to do this, but this is not the place, and this happened in many negotiating rooms. Some developing countries actually voiced their opinion and said, well, you haven't met your commitment right now, how can we trust you? this is very human, and this is going to play a role. What the role is going to be, it's going to be interesting to follow up on the COP presidency in Egypt, I believe. So, but how the negotiations are going to play out in the upcoming years, I think they're going to be shaped by this sentiment. There's something happening, but it's interesting to follow up.
Excellent. So we'll stay tuned. Amelie, so I was really impressed with the sort of momentum that the youth movements and youth groups put towards, with the focal point of the COP, right? The mock COP, the Youth for COP, the Conference for Youth, and so much energy directed towards the COP. And I know that your remarks reflected this. There was both some sense of success, but a great sense of lots of work left to do. But a lot of that work, especially as we move towards implementation, has to move away from a single focal point of a COP to 196 countries, or at least many of them. How do you see the momentum or energy or anger directed at the COP translating to what the youth movement does nationally, what the youth movement does locally?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the word anger is probably pretty accurate that you used, but I think it's also anxiety. If you look at the speeches given by a lot of youth leaders at COP, they express like a strong sense of climate anxiety that grows among my generation. And I think that, yes, COP has been a big focal point of the movement, but something else, it serves as just an ability to bring together national movements and network between them, because no response to the climate crisis can be in one country. And these networks of youth that have grown are international. They're not just based in one country. So instead of COP being the specific focus of all these movements, it's been a point from which they can expand their reach and their resources. I think I'll take the example that I'm more involved with, which is Stop Ecocide. It's an international movement that basically seeks to criminalize ecocide at the International Criminal Court. And so it's popped up in many countries around the world. COP has been a specific focal point because delegates from a lot of the different national groups have been able to come to COP and kind of reach out to people beyond this movement, talk about it, get the word out, and build connections. Even at one of our events in COP, David Lammy, an MP in the UK, expressed the support of the UK's opposition party for an ecocide law at the International Criminal Court. And so it's been this kind of fantastic opportunity for the movements to grow. I think it's also important for movements just in the sense that there's a massive amount of media attention that comes onto COP, as we know. And so youth protests, individual organizations can get news articles around the globe about them simply by being there. However, obviously, all this momentum, all this attention is insufficient if movements can't go back domestically now and actually affect change. And I think we're seeing that the momentum we've built from COP is looking to be carried forward, but I think it'll be really interesting to see how we can translate that into domestic action now. So campaigns in different countries are looking to use all those connections we've built now to get meetings with our political officials, to continue pushing for policy changes, to continue growing our networks. And it's something that will carry forward through the next year. Just because COP is done does not mean that action is done. It means that it's starting.
Excellent, thank you. Jen, I'm going to ask you a similar question that I asked to Kim, but from a slightly different perspective. And I was especially struck by your comments on the continuity of the COP, right? That this is, in some ways, this was the same old, right? And if you looked at a graph of urgency or climate emergency, that's gone up exponentially, and the COP just sort of goes along linearly, and it's trugs along in its own pace. In some ways, it has become an ends, not a means. And so I'm going to ask you if there should be a COP27, especially in light of your reflection on continuity, your reflection that these covering agreements could be counterproductive in opening up new things when we should be focusing on the implementation, but then also that a lot of the sort of collective aspects of the climate regime are now sort of settled. We don't need to negotiate. We actually just need to do. So should there be a COP27, or should it be radically different than the COPs that we've seen before?
So I'm going to say yes, there should be, and yes, it should be radically different. Because the exciting thing about being in implementation mode is now it's time to really hold countries to account. Their obligations are crystal clear. They're on a publicly accessible website. My students have a country they're trolling through what that country's NDC says. So we know what they're supposed to be doing now. We know what they've promised. Now they actually have obligations to report every 2 years. We have a global stock take every 5 years. That's going to say how we're doing. We know exactly when they're going to come back and put in better NDCs. And there's a legally binding part of the Paris Agreement that says each NDC must be more ambitious than the last. So we need to implement this, and that's why we need COP, because it's going to shine the light on the leaders and the laggards. These cover decisions, they could be counterproductive, or they could be a vehicle for transformation. We could get more coal language in there. We could, the fossil fuel language around subsidies, it's what the G7 and G20 have been saying for, I don't even know how long now. But it could be a place to put in new, better ideas. So it could be a positive space as well. So for the radically different parts, here's the thing about shining a light on these national reports and on the global stocktake is it's a bit boring and it's going to be very technical because negotiators and lawyers designed it. And if there's one thing that UNFCCC negotiators love, it's making things as confusing as possible, using as much jargon and everything as possible. So they designed the transparency system for themselves, not for the public. So I had this wild idea that I've put in a small publication a bit, where we split COP in half. We have a public-facing, high-level, get the ministers, get all the pavilions, get all the movements, get them all together in the spring. They can bounce off each other. They don't need to worry about what the negotiators are doing. They can grow their movement. They can speak to leaders who won't be sidelined by what text is in what negotiation. They can speak to all the business leaders. And in the years when they have to send in new NDCs, they can do that and have the big platform for the big announcement in spring when they're actually due. They're not due at COP. They're due 9 months before COP. So do it then. Do it in front of the whole world who's going to hold you account to those promises. Then have your boring technical COP in the winter. Webcast those transparency things if anyone can make sense of what the heck they're saying. Make all the reports publicly available. We all have the internet now. We don't all have to go to the boring technical COP. Maybe it could always be in Bonn or something like that. But we could split them in half. We could, because my worry is if the negotiations get boring, people will stop going and we're going to lose all the wonderful things that Amelie just talked about and that Kim talked about nation to nation relationships. So maybe by splitting it, we could get the best of both worlds still.
Yeah, that's a really interesting proposal. We'll see if that gets, who knows? Who knows? There'll also be more room at the boring negotiations for academics to be in the room. All right. Thank you all so much for these wonderful reflections. We've got 3 questions from the audience already, and I'm going to encourage people, if you've been saving your questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We've got plenty of time for questions. I'm going to start with a relatively big one. Is all this, and this I think could be for all of you, because I think there's different angles on this. Is all this talk of temperature targets meaningful when A, many countries provide misleading figures on their emissions, especially from land use change, and B, nobody is counting induced emissions from where our warming causes natural carbon sinks to become sources? So I think there's some technical aspects, specifics to that, but then all this, the larger question of whether temperature targets are what we really should be focusing on in the COPs, in the negotiations, and in the global response to climate change. And we want to take a crack at that one, either the sort of specifics or the larger question of temperature targets.
Well, I think that others can speak to the specifics of this a bit better than I can, but I would like to bring up just like the service that temperature targets kind of serve to the general populations, which is not everybody has time in their day to read everything that comes out of these conferences. Not everybody has time to sort through every specific target. So I think temperature targets provide a pretty standard ideal that we can work towards, even if it represents more than just that temperature. So when we say 1.5 degrees, we mean a whole variety of things. We mean being able to finance energy transitions in developing countries, and being sure that that transition is not something that's imposed by the global north on the global south. We mean things like making sure we reduce our emissions so that we can prevent the worst effects of climate change. So it's not just the temperature targets. I think it encompasses a variety of actions and a variety of measures that we can refer to more easily. However, I do agree that there are quite a bit of issues when we're solely relying on those targets, brought up quite aptly in the question. And obviously other people can speak to this better, but I think it can't be the only thing we're using, but it does serve a good purpose as kind of an ideal to work towards when we're trying to have more general discussions about increasing ambition.
Thank you. Excellent. Other thoughts?
So just quickly, to add another wrinkle is I'm less convinced that we should be talking about global average temperature, because the Arctic, for example, in Canada is already pretty darn close to 1.5, whereas the rest of the world is on average about 1.1. Famously in Copenhagen, the lead negotiator for the African group, I think he was from Sudan that year, said 1.5 is a suicide pact for Africa. Because by then the effects of 1.5 will be much higher and worse when we're at the global 1.5 versus what would be experienced in equatorial regions. So 1.5 is very useful, as Emily said. We need something to push for, and science needs models to build from, and they need to know what the end result is. But we have to keep in mind what 1.5 globally will mean for specific regions.
I haven't actually thought about this question very much in terms of what it does for us. But you know, in listening to other folks' responses and thinking a little bit more, I'm actually wondering to what extent it's really, you know, something that helps us gain any traction, right, among people. It's not something that you're like, oh yes, now we've achieved 1.5, that it's like a cuddly charismatic species that you've somehow protected. And I wonder if something that highlights more of the human costs, right, of where we're headed, because this is not about you know, a few thousand people losing their homes. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people, and potentially, you know, billions. And so I think that on the one hand, you know, there's been a lot of work on framing and the role that framing plays and trying to shift people's positions, and we also know that, at least in the US, the environmental movement was very bad at framing this in the early days, right? And that we've lost a lot of ground due to those sort of early sort of global warming conversations instead of climate change. But I do think that we might want to think about a different metric that speaks closer to people's lived experiences, right? Like how they really understand what climate change is, how many people don't have water, how many people can't grow food, how many people's homes or countries are underwater, right? Like those are the human costs of this that we are just simply not really, we're not measuring effectively in a way that captures the public's sentiment. And I, you know, I don't like to be alarmist, but this is pretty alarming where we're headed. So we need a fundamental rethinking of what we're even talking about when we're talking about solving climate change.
Yeah, I'll go next, and I think there's a very interesting question. One on how meaningful the targets are. I think it's one thing that I would like to reflect on is that the importance of the target of the global average temperature target is that it's based on science. I think that's the beauty of the global average temperature, that we can track it, we know what it means, even though it's complex and we need models, but it's based on science. It deviates from previous language, for example, is carbon neutrality, which who knows what it meant, what it included, what was the role, for example, of offsets and any other mechanisms that you included. But the global average temperature is really based on science. So but there's also the human aspect, the suffering aspect that the panel has mentioned, in the climate justice aspects of this global average temperature. So when Dr. Allen and Dr. Cecilia were talking, and also Emily, I was thinking about a conversation that happened when the Paris Agreement was adopted. That an African negotiator said, you just condemned my country and my people with the 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees means suffering. It's not, even though everyone celebrates this, it's been suffering. But it's something that we can track. It's based on science, and there's trust in this global average temperature. So if it's meaningful, I strongly believe it is. There is something that we can measure. On understanding the emissions, and I think this relates to the boring side of now the COP. But I think the role of the technical expert review team is going to be very important, because they are the ones that are going to be going to countries, or doing this remotely, or doing this in Bonn, but looking into and doing a very exhaustive review for every country. That this hasn't happened before. Only developed countries had it, but many developing nations didn't go through a review in that sense. It was only an analysis, almost like a checklist if things have been reported or not. But here, if things are not estimated correctly, if things have been missed, what data is being used, so really the boring side of the COP, but it's important. It's an important side, because that's how you can hold accountable of those that have not met or have done shady or sketchy stuff in their estimates and what they report. So I think one, it is the role of the technical expert review team that is going to be part of the next couple of years is going to be fundamental in the process. And the guidelines that have been set in COP26 are important, are necessary. And I think it really gives value of the next process. But what decisions come out of this? So hopefully it's not about transparency for transparency, but that it becomes in a transformative action. So it's not just about having another report and that's it, but the decisions and political decisions and commitments are transformative and can be taken with those actions and the work from the technical expert review. I think that's something that we need to look at.
All right, after a bit of a slow start, our audience has really picked up with the questions. And so we've got a number of them in the queue. And I'm going to apologize at the outset if we don't get to everybody's questions. I'm going to actually combine 3 of them, and I'll try and do it in a creative way, because they're getting at some things, some common themes here. And first is a question, is there a way to make the COP process, international climate negotiations, more binding, right? Or is it a process that is just set up to be a declaration of principles? And I'd like you to think about that question in relation to 2 others, right? One is that another person asked about the role of non-state actors, specifically around accountability and tracking process. And I think that is an interesting counterpoint to the notion of binding agreements and where accountability comes from, right? Within this process. And then there's a sort of a more specific and critical comment a critical question, not critical at you all, but critical at the process, about, and this is also, it dovetails with questions of bindingness and accountability. Basically, has COP moved the needle at all in capitalism's responsibility for using the earth as a dumping ground for its externalities, right? As it actually contributed to GHG reductions from corporations, from shipping, from wars, space travel, they note, right? And so can it be more binding? Whose responsibility is for accountability, and where, and has that, has the rubber hit the road? Have we got anything from this process? So I'll invite you to, obviously not necessarily having to deal with all of those, that compound question, but thoughts on this. But I'm going to ask each one of you to comment on this, so I will just pick so you're not looking at me awkwardly. Jen, why don't you go first?
All right. Yeah, it's an interesting bundle together. I mean, in terms of what countries have to do, we know it's legally binding under the Paris Agreement. So to have an NDC, to maintain it, to make the next ones better, and to report on progress. So all the words of the Paris Agreement, that's what's legally binding. But I should say that when countries sign up to things that aren't legally binding, but are in treaties, they tend to follow them. Whether or not what they're following is good enough. Most countries, except for Canada that bailed, they actually hit their Kyoto Protocol targets. Those targets obviously weren't strong enough, but they lived up to them. So, there is a glimmer of hope there. In terms of accountability for non-state actors, this is really interesting. And I think, to my mind, this is a potential threat that the UN is not thinking about yet and should be. So there is this huge drive in the lead up to Paris to bring corporations and cities and bring them together in a way that would help show that the whole world is moving on for climate action. We're all in. And it helped put pressure on countries to adopt the Paris Agreement and to finish that work. So there was a strategic reason there, but also a reason to help orchestrate climate action amongst companies that maybe otherwise weren't thinking about it. And there is a light bit of sort of a light touch monitoring and review. I think it's in the yearbooks that the UN puts out. And Antonio Guterres announced that he was going to set up an expert panel that would start deciding what should count as a good net zero pledge. Because he's starting to realize, as I think we all are, that net zero are some nice words, but we don't really have a good sense of what the heck country or companies and countries mean when they use those words. And increasingly, it's starting to look like we're going to plant forests the size of India to make up for, say, Shell and Microsoft. So that's an interesting idea that the UN Secretary General is taking on himself. And I mention this because it's going to be some form finally of holding corporations maybe to more account for the words that they use, or that maybe their PR people put out. Because we haven't moved the needle on this, and because in bringing together or trying to orchestrate all this action by companies, they've given the podium to people that maybe they shouldn't. And it's going to maybe undermine the legitimacy of the UN ultimately. So Jeff Bezos had the big stage in Glasgow, gave a speech about climate change. Nobody asked him about what the emissions were from his little space program. And if they continue to do this, I think this could start to raise real questions and undermine, I want to say the brand of the UN, and that's not really the language I want to use, but I'm getting at that the UN stands for something, and giving the stage to major emitters and not asking them to take account for that could undermine what the UN is, what we hope it stands for.
Great, thank you. Raul.
Well, one thing that I've been thinking about the role of non-state actors and how to hold them accountable. I think it's this is definitely something, a conversation to take place. It's not. I don't think a COP is a place where they should come and just promote everything nice, everything is good without any responsibilities. I mean, it's. I think this is enshrined also in the part of CBDR, and many countries and non-state actors understand this. And I think that's, for example, now that like my PhD is focused on CBDR, like trying to understand how do you go beyond just international level and responsibilities. And I think that the accountability part is very important. But the one issue is also the reliance on the international negotiations on non-state actors. And for example, I'm going to use as an example climate finance, that many countries wanted to include the participation and the provision of climate finance from the private institutions. This is important because private institutions, they don't give grants, they give loans. And how much of that that climate finance is going to be loan-based is going to be fundamental for and it's going to have an impact to countries. I remember there was a talk from Oxfam that they made a very interesting reference. They said giving a loan to a developing country on climate finance is almost as if I'm driving your car, I crash it, and I give you a loan to fix your car. So that's one important thing. Now on whether the negotiation should be more binding or if this is a natural process, I think there are many items that have changed very fast. For example, I mentioned one was science. Another one is gender. Is gender equality and empowerment language and the decisions and the importance of this, how it's transformational, how mitigation actions and adaptation actions have to be gender responsive. I think this is a shift in the language, but it takes time. Those normative dynamics are not instantaneous, or there is a process where it has to follow. But things have changed, and I think that's an important thing. Whether there should be more binding or not, yeah, as Dr. Ahn mentioned, the problem is everything that is in the Paris Agreement is binding. Whatever else comes, it must have a very strong language. But we're stuck with the language of the Paris Agreement. If we have something else, another agreement beyond Paris, like that's probably a place to have it. But at the moment, we're stuck with Paris, and this is what we need to strengthen. But the role of non-state actors is going to be important to follow as well. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Kim.
Thanks so much. So I want to focus more on sort of the latter two questions, the non-state actors, and then have we moved capitalism at all, and think about the big solution that we're really missing in climate governance, and that's land rights. And I see another question in the queue about thinking beyond humans, right, in terms of impact. And if we look at the data, 85% of the world's remaining biodiversity and 20% of forest carbon is on indigenous lands, right? And only 10% of indigenous lands are recognized by nation states around the world. So the single best thing that we could do that immediately, that's low cost, although apparently politically quite difficult, is help secure land rights, right? So that communities can continue to practice their life ways wherever that takes them. But it also takes that land out of the land grabbing sort of capitalist engine that is driving so much of this climate change. I was told recently by a hedge fund manager that the minute I start talking about reducing emissions from consumption, I lose all credibility, which is sort of an interesting state of the world, right? But I think that if we think that we can continue this path without major changes, right, in how we behave, how we act, and how our economy runs, we lose all credibility. And I think a lot about Indigenous ways of knowing. I am not Indigenous myself, but I work with a lot of communities, and so much of the orientation and the worldview is founded on this principle that we have obligations and responsibilities to our older than human relatives. So that's to the land, to the air, to the water, to plants, to animals, and that our life should be guided by carrying out our obligations and our responsibilities. And I'm not sure why this sounds radical, because I think we've somehow defined radical in this way that as long as if it's anything but maintaining the status quo, it's somehow radical. But I think that, you know, one Indigenous policy advisor recently said at another event that we need to redefine what we mean if we really want to think about driving new solutions. So I guess that was kind of a bit of a ramble, but I do think there's a role for non-state actors to play in redefining how we have defined climate change as almost purely an emissions problem, which it is not, right? It is a justice problem. And if we want to solve that, we need to speak in justice terms.
Thank you. Amelie?
Yeah, I am quite a big supporter of everything that Kimberly just said. I think everything about norms is something that I would very much support. But the question of can we make this more binding is something that is quite interesting for me. I think that when we look at the status quo, companies have a responsibility, a strong one, to their shareholders to make money. And they're operating within this set of rules for society that don't bind them as a primary consideration to think about things like climate change, environmental standards. We do have environmental regulations, but as we know, these vary by jurisdiction. And if we're looking at extractive companies, when they're operating in other countries, they often can slip between legal loopholes, cause huge environmental destruction. And so for me, I'm a big proponent of looking at ways to make environmental considerations more binding. And obviously my work on ecocide is reflective of this. But I think a big pushback comes whenever we talk about legal instruments to bind people to their environmental promises. Something that's touted often from what you hear from politicians and negotiators is the success of Paris was in not binding people and not alienating countries because it was binding. But I think that's quite problematic when the success of Paris is coming out of getting everyone's buy-in because they're not being held to anything. And I think that kind of addresses the last question, have we moved the needle at all? A little bit, but considering that none of this is binding, again, it's very hard to make the kind of radical changes that we need. And so one of the founders of Stop Ecocide, Polly Higgins, has quite an interesting quote about this. And in one of her writings, she talks about climate change as a symptom. And she says that instead of addressing the root causes, we continue to address climate change like a cold, like treating the symptoms of a cold instead of treating the root cause of it, and waiting for it to recede without actually treating the root. And I think that's quite important, and it ties into a lot of what Kimberly was saying around the norms that we have established in our world that drive this kind of extractive consumerist society that's destroying our world. And we need some kind of fundamental norm switch in order to change behavior. And whether that looks like a legal instrument or whether this looks like something else, we do need to look at our worldview and critically examine how we don't treat nature as an entity with rights. Right now, nature is something that serves humans, and it's conceived as this entity that is there for our purpose, there for our money. And so as Kimberly talked about, like Indigenous ways of knowing often conceive nature with much more of an importance and much more of a centrality to the world. And I think we need to look at this as a model going forward. We can't keep treating nature as our personal dumping ground and our personal service instrument. We need to start conceiving it as something that is fundamental to our life and that we need to have a reciprocal relationship with. And in that sense, I think legally binding instruments can be one way forward, but we also need to look at other innovative solutions in order to create this sense of accountability in this new norm.
Thank you so much. And I think we're going to close on that. And what you heard from those answers to those last questions were various calls for transformation, not radical transformation, but transformation that we need. And in fact, Simon Dalby at University of Wilfrid Laurier often talks about it's actually the status quo that's radical. And this is just transformation that we need in multiple dimensions. And so with that, I want to thank our panelists for an incredibly stimulating and informative discussion. Thank the audience for your wonderful questions and for attending and listening. And wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you so much.